Well, hello. I am Pauletta Hansel, and I am happy to be interviewing this lovely lady who will tell us, please, your name and where you live.
My name is Linda Hudson, and currently I live in Covington, Louisiana.
Wow, you're far away. Not Covington, Cincinnati, or Covington, Kentucky, rather.
Kentucky, no man.
Across from Cincinnati. And so I'll also just say that I am doing this interview with Linda for the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition Story Gathering Project, where we are gathering stories of people who have had some connection with Cincinnati and some connection with Appalachia, and Linda does both. So I'm really happy to be talking to you, Linda.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited about the project. And so, I just I'm very honored to be a part of it.
Thank you. We're honored to have you. So Linda, I'll start by asking you where you were born and approximately when. You don't need to be specific if you want, but just sort of give us a sense of the timing.
Nobody wants to tell their age.
That's right. except for the 15-year-olds that we interview.
Right. I was actually born in London, Kentucky. And that was in the 60s. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
And when I was born in London, Kentucky in the 60s. So I'm just answering the questions as you ask them at this point.
That sounds fine. Although you should feel free to just jump in with what you're interested in talking about, because I think you're probably going to answer this next question is where you grew up.
Well, when I was 5 years old, my family and I migrated to Cincinnati. And at that time, when we moved, we were currently living in McKee, Kentucky, which is Eastern Kentucky. And my dad took a job at General Motors in Norwood. And like everyone at that time, we migrated to Cincinnati. So we first arrived in Cincinnati. We lived in Norwood. I was in the first grade, probably about half of the year in the first grade. And then we moved to, at that time, Madison Place. And that's kind of where I grew up the first half of my life. So,
will you tell me what it was like growing up there? And I guess one of the things I'm also interested, because if you didn't migrate until you were 5, you probably have some memory of what it was like in McKee as well. And so maybe just talk about sort of
absolutely, yes. And my story, I tell my story, and if I can do a mention of my book, I mention a lot of those details in my book called Jilted to Jesus. And that's me sitting on Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina when I was a kid.
Wow.
So we used to always go back to visit the hills and the mountains, right? So that was my family's thing for family vacations. But yes, growing up for a while, we lived in Kentucky. And I just remember like being in the woods a lot. Like I'm a nature lover, but for us growing up as kids, we would always go to our aunts and uncles and we would play in the woods. And even when I was young, my dad, because I was a daddy's girl, would take me squirrel hunting with him in the woods. But in McKee, Kentucky, I remember my dad worked for a newspaper called the Sentinel Echo. And he was a typesetter there. And I went to Head Start. And I remember vaguely some of those memories from childhood, but I remember being picked up by the school bus and we would arrive at Head Start in McKee, Kentucky, and they would feed us breakfast. And I will never forget, it was the weirdest thing. Like I loved the smell of scrambled eggs with butter and toast. Like that was my favorite. So those are some of the childhood memories. And of course, we would always go back and visit. I have great childhood memories of, visiting my aunts and uncles and my grandmas and just exploring the hills, the eastern hills of Kentucky. And we would visit where, like my mom, she was Cherokee Indian and my dad was Scotch Irish. So they were a combination, quite the combination, being married. But I remember we would visit my dad's original cabin that he grew up in. It was tucked way back in the hills of Eastern Kentucky. I couldn't even tell you the location. I do know it was near like Laurel Lake back in there. But and my mom grew up in Egypt, Kentucky. So when my dad later in life took me back there, his dad died when he was 2 years old. So his mother, my grandma Rose Parker, raised 5 kids back in that time all by herself. She was a single mom.
Wow.
And she was, I think, where a lot of my grit and hard work ethic came from, because I can't imagine raising 5 children alone during that time and the Depression. But he showed me this little cabin, and they never had indoor plumbing. You know, it was tucked way back in the woods. And at that time, it was a little kind of weeds growing up around it. But I got to discover like some of my heritage. And my grandma, I would go stay with her in the summertime, and Granny Rose. And so she raised chickens and pigs, and she had a cow. But like growing up, I would spend the summers in Kentucky with my grandma, my Granny Rose, or some of my aunts. But the one thing I remember, we would get up really early. We would go gather the eggs and milk the cows and bring that in. And she would churn butter on her porch. She had like a hand churner. So we would always have fresh butter, and she would make big cat eye biscuits with red eye gravy from the ham. And so those are just all smells. I can smell the breakfast cooking at the moment. And she had, again, no indoor plumbing. So we would have to use the outhouse. In the summer, it wasn't so bad, but in the winter, it was freezing out there. That was not a comfortable thing. But so I just remember growing up with all those memories of every summer we would visit, or even go back in the winter and visit. It was like we were always trying to get back to the hills of Kentucky, you know?
Yeah.
So,
well,
and I
want you to keep talking, but it just is making me think of a question, and that is, I mean, you would have been in Norwood and Cincinnati in the probably the mid to late 60s and early 70s, and that would have been kind of at the height of of some of that wave of migration. And so I'm curious about sort of the going back and forth. And were you around other people who were from Eastern Kentucky?
Always.
In all that, sort of like how it felt to kind of be living in 2 different places in a way.
Yeah, and I talk about a little bit about in Norwood, there were probably a lot of transplants from there. So being with my dad, again, daddy's girl, I would hang out with him a lot, and he would go pick up his check on Saturday. And there was a little bar and grill he would go to, and we would get a poor boy hamburger, and it was huge. And I remember going to cash his check on Saturday with him in Norwood, and just, he would drive me by the plant. And then when we were living there as kids, like one of the things that we would do as a family, they had a drive-in in Norwood, which was by the White Castle hamburgers. So
I know exactly where that is. I live in Paddock Hills, which is just down the hill from Norwood. So I walk that way a lot on my long walks during the week.
Isn't that funny? So I remember when we were still living there, we would pile all the family in the family car, go pick up a bag of White Castles and go to the drive-in. So that was our outing for the weekend as a family.
And probably was it the Oakley drive-in? Is that where you went?
I think that was it. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So it was just an interesting life. But I do remember when we moved to Madison Place and I started school there, and I was going to the public school for a while. There was a lot of people that weren't from Kentucky there, especially in the Mariemont area, because I was a bookworm. So I would always ride my bicycle to the Mariemont Library and check out books and come home. And but I remember even in school later in life, more so, and I talk about this in my book, Jilted to Jesus, but especially when I started junior high at Walnut Hills High School. Which is a college prep school. So I started there in the 7th grade. And I remember there were a lot of more affluent kids there, so to speak. And I never felt like I fit in. And my clothes were, my jeans were from Kmart. And, I didn't have the most fancy labels on my clothes. And they would call me hillbilly, and they would make fun of me. So I had a lot of that kind of thing, even as a kid, that I dealt with. And, growing up with that for a little while was really, until I got older, of course, which I learned to embrace and love my heritage.
Mhm.
But for a while, I was really ashamed of my heritage,
Yeah.
of being a hillbilly, because we were so ostracized
Right.
in
Right.
that environment. And so I know now how people feel when they feel like their culture doesn't really fit,
Mhm.
or they're ostracized for their color or their race or
Right.
whatever. So but it was something that we had to overcome, I think, as children. And I think it just really made us more tenacious. It made us stronger in a way.
Mhm.
And so growing up with that, it was just, there was a lot of that, but we had so many good memories. And my mom would always grow a garden.
Mhm.
We eventually, towards the latter half of my life, I was in the, I started ninth grade. We moved to the Eastgate area, which
Mhm.
is where my mom currently lives. And when we moved to Eastgate, we had enough property that they would always have a garden every year. So my mom, I got to see her raise fresh vegetables and bring those in and can those and put those up for the winter. And, we would always, there, for her, because of her culture as a, coming out of a Cherokee Indian culture, she was very artistic. She still is, but she would do things like in the winter, she would hand quilt. So she had a big loom and she would just hand quilt, and she sewed and she did all those things. She made her clothes, and then she would do beadwork. I remember her making me moccasins when I was a kid, and she would make this beautiful beadwork to go on the moccasins. And then, there was just it was such a rich culture growing up. And my mom and dad were both very talented musically. So my dad played the banjo and my mom played the guitar and the juice harp, the harmonica, right? And
Yeah.
so they would sit in the living room and they would jam together. That's kind of what I grew
Right.
up
Now, do
listening
you
to.
play music?
Now, this is another story. Like, I'm not very musically talented. I really, really want to play the banjo. And I have friends that are gracious enough to help me and teach me. And it is the hardest instrument, I think. I've tried to play the guitar. I think the banjo is the hardest to learn to play. So I would like to aspire to do that. So my dad's banjos got passed down to me. I have them here with me. And so I've attempted. I'm still trying to learn, but I've attempted it. I'm not good at it.
Well, we'd love to hear you once you feel comfortable sharing it.
I don't know if you would.
Yeah, we would. So I've got like this little cluster of questions. I'm just going to go ahead and answer them, or ask them rather, all at once, to see, because I feel like they're probably connected. So one is I could see in the background that you have children and grandchildren. And so I'm just curious about whether, your Appalachian background, because you grew up there and you kept going back there. And, and I don't know if you use the term or not, but you can tell me that. But I'm just wondering, I guess one is how your children and even grandchildren may not be old enough, but how your children sort of relate to that background, and do they think of themselves as being Appalachian in any way?
And that's a great question. My grandchild, I have one biological child.
Mhm.
He's 31 years old. His name is Braden, and one grandchild by him. His name is Bo, and he's a little over 2. And that's who you see in the background.
Yeah.
I do have other children through my husband's marriage. I have 4 other children and 11 other grandchildren by
Wow.
marriage. So we have a large family. So they probably don't really, they grew up here in Louisiana, but my
Mhm.
son actually got to spend some time with my father before he passed. So my son would go fishing with my dad and he would listen to him play the banjo. So he's visited some of my cousins in Kentucky, but like there isn't a big, I think especially here, because we both live in Louisiana, my son and myself. There isn't a big Appalachian heritage here. It's a little more Cajun, so it's a little different. But he kind of knows a little bit about his history, but probably not as much as like when we were growing up as kids. Like we were always in Kentucky,
Yeah.
like in the summers or to visit in the winters and at Christmas. And, we had family reunions where, again, we would all these musicians would just gather on the front porch and play music, and we would just have potlucks and family reunions. And he doesn't really get that. He doesn't get that heritage here.
Yeah.
So it's a great question. And I hope by your storytelling that you're sharing, and I hope that we can pass on some of that culture to our children and even our grandchildren.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we do too. And with the books you write too, because that's another way. And I'm going to ask you about a little bit more about your book, but first I am just curious, and then we'll end with your book, but I'm just curious about how you got to Louisiana.
Long story short, my husband.
Okay.
So my husband grew up here in Louisiana. His dad was a pastor actually here in Louisiana. But yeah, I met my husband in Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
He was the CEO of a large commercial design build construction company. And the rest is history. I talk a little bit about that in my book. But his children were here and his grandchildren. So we just drugged my child with us at that time. He was a teenager. And we just made the transition to Louisiana so he could be with his children and watch his grandchildren grow up. So
yeah, well, that's great. And you're working in Louisiana. I know that because we talked
yes.
earlier. What's your? I mean, you're a writer, but what's your other profession as well?
Yes, I work for a residential recovery program that helps people with substance abuse and mental health disorders. And we just implemented a big veterans program there where we're taking all veterans because they're dealing with so much, of course, younger and older veterans, PTSD, substance abuse, addiction. And so I'm very honored to be a part of that to help our veterans. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. And that was, I talked a little bit about my transformation and the things that I basically overcame in my book as far as substance abuse and trauma and addiction. Yeah. So it really is a transformational story for me. But
yeah, and so it sounds like that so your life and your upbringing then really did lead you to the kind of helpful work that you're doing now.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah. Well, tell us about your book and tell us if you have a website, feel free to spell it out so that.
Thank you. Yes. My book is titled Jilted to Jesus. So I don't know if you can see it here.
Jilted to Jesus. It says rejection to redemption.
Yes, ma'am. And so I talk about how I went from the hills of Kentucky to the California sun. So at 17 years old, I graduated high school in Glen Estee, and I moved to Los Angeles. I followed my high school sweetheart out there. But I really got involved with a lot of the wrong people, the wrong men, and drugs and drinking. And, I'm not condemning anyone for what they do. I made a lot of bad choices, but a lot of it, what I experienced was rejection. And I talk about that in my book. And there's some trauma things in there that I experienced in high school. I think that kind of made me lead to those bad decisions. But then I had kind of a spiritual awakening, if you will, when I moved to Louisiana. And I really just, through my life and my faith, I found the strength to overcome those things. So I'm very blessed to have Jesus as my hero in my life. But
yeah. Well, thank you for telling us about it. It sounds really interesting. So where can people get it if they want to get it?
They can get it on all websites, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, even Walmart. Okay. So you can order it online, absolutely, Jilted to Jesus, and just type that in the search bar and it'll bring it up.
Great. Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you so much for
thank you for having me. This is so fun. And, it's always good to relive the memories, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And so I will go ahead and stop our recording, and that way we will be able to get it up so that people will see it.
Awesome. Thank you.